the podcast medium is obviously different than radio per se. And so that idea of just taking your creative on radio and putting it in podcasts, like it doesn't fit. Like, with radio, you need to like yell at a person in order to get their attention versus podcasts. There's obviously more nuance behind it. So we absolutely do our due diligence in regards to like once we hear a spot, if a client is supplying audio, we usually get feedback on it. We try to make it as reflective over whatever shows it's running across in order to do our best to match at least the tone, not of that particular show, but the tone of podcasts in general. So it doesn't have to be this loud and boisterous ad with like millions of different sound effects and what have you.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Podcast Live. Today I am joined by Ray Harkins, who works at Wondery, and we are going to be diving into how to make the best ad experience for your show and your listeners. Ray, how are you doing today?
Splendid. Anytime anybody wants to talk to me about podcasts, I'm here for it.
Before we dive into the questions, why don't you explain to us what your role is at Wondery?
Yes. So I've been at Wondery for a little bit less than a year, but basically I am a senior account executive. So basically it's like I'm just talking to clients, talking to agencies to advocate for the shows that are in the Wondery network to run ads on them and why they should partner with us. And I've been doing some version of that for the better part of about 10 years. And so because of that, I've been able to dabble around with a lot of different aspects of the podcasting experience. But yes, ad sales, if you just are generically explaining it, is what I do.
When you are doing this, are you interacting with both the podcasts themselves and the brands who are interested in running ads?
Sometimes, yes. Most networks do have a partnership, or they have like a million different labels, but there usually is a interaction or a person or a staff of people that are attached to podcasts where they're communicating with them in regards to asks and different requests and stuff. But from the ad sales side of things, a small portion of the time, like we're communicating with the host directly, asking them questions and being able to work on whatever it is that we're trying to pitch. For the most part though, it's like I would say it's mostly agency or client facing rather than communicating with the podcasters directly.
Okay. And as far as finding the right fit goes, how do you figure out if a brand is the right fit for a specific podcast? Or I imagine at a place like Wondery, you're kind of thinking in groups of podcasts. You're not necessarily just targeting one podcast with one brand each time. Maybe a brand is like, hey, I'd like to advertise on these 5 or 6 shows. And obviously you guys want to be sort of aware of how many shows are running ads for the same brands at the same time.
Yeah. So in simplest of terms, like when we're looking at pairing up, clients versus the shows, usually we're drilling down really specifically on the client side in regards to what their KPIs are concerned, their key performance indicators, where it's like, hey, are you looking for more brand awareness? Are you looking for more performance based, so direct response? Usually most brands are kind of a blend of both, but they lean more towards one side or the other. So once you kind of have these marching orders from the client or the agency, then you're able to look at either specific shows or, to your point, like a collection of shows or a specific genre that does well. So usually it is, a mixture of both, where it's like, hey, we're recommending some particular shows that, do well from a performance side of things or, have a large audience. Whatever the blend is that matches with what the client is looking for, that's usually what we recommend. But it usually is a mixture of specific shows and then some tactics that are reaching, whether it's like an audience targeting play or whether it's a specific run of network where it's like, hey, let's run in this, true crime run of network or sports run of network where it's running across a lot of shows. But because of that, you are getting more scale as far as, because if you're running in a collection of shows, there's more impressions to be had versus just one specific show. So usually it's a blend of both as long as you're finding the appropriate fit for whatever the client's needs are.
Yeah, and I imagine too that you have not necessarily parameters, but say for instance, you have a show that doesn't want a specific type of brand or ad running on their show. I know this is common within something like Megaphone's dynamic ad insertion, where you can go through and you can select the categories that you are willing to run ads for. So, like, if a music podcast doesn't want to run political ads or something like that, you can sort of exclude those. Do you guys also have a system for doing that? Just with different types of brands and the categories they fall into. Obviously, it's probably not something as automated as Megaphone where you just go into the settings, but I imagine you guys have something like that too.
Yeah, we go through a pretty extensive vetting process with our hosts, especially obviously if they're lending their own voice to it and they're talking about personal experience. But there are layers where usually once a show, and this is broadly speaking across most networks, once a show enters the network, they talk about their ad preferences as far as like, okay, I'm very comfortable in reading for these type of brands, or like, this is a category I'm not going to read ads for. And so once that layer gets started, then usually we dive deeper in regards to, okay, now we have more specific brands in these categories that you've already approved and you're interested in reading for. And we tap those hosts on the shoulder to be like, hey, would you be comfortable voicing this? And we do have a system that, assists with us in that. It's not as automated as Megaphone of what you're talking about, but there is an automation process and where we're able to vet, 20 to 30 of our shows at one time rather than, like emailing 30 individual shows, because that can get pretty cumbersome.
From the podcast side of things, how do you make sure that the ad reads sort of come across in a way that fits the tone of the show so that it's not a jarring experience for listeners? Because I know sometimes when you use Megaphone's dynamic ad insertion, for instance, again, just because this is the one I'm familiar with, sometimes it's jarring to be listening to someone's podcast and then you suddenly hear like a Starbucks ad that's not read by the host or one of the producers on the show. It's just an ad that like Starbucks created that is getting dropped into shows. So since you're working on a bit more of a personal level, how do you make sure that what the hosts are doing with the ad read as well fits the tone of the show, or, what the brand is providing to the podcast hosts as well?
Yeah, it's incredibly important. Just as a podcast nerd myself, like, you're hitting the nail on the head and you're scratching an itch. That is something that I articulate all the time to clients and agencies, because the podcast medium is obviously different than radio per se. And so that idea of just taking your creative on radio and putting it in podcasts, like, it doesn't fit. Like, with radio, you need to like yell at a person in order to get their attention, versus podcasts, there's obviously more nuance behind it. So we absolutely do our due diligence in regards to, like, once we hear a spot, if a client is supplying audio, we usually get feedback on it. We try to make it as reflective over whatever shows it's running across in order to, do our best to match at least the tone, not of podcast of that particular show, but the tone of podcasts in general. So it doesn't have to be this, loud and boisterous ad with like, millions of different sound effects and what have you. So yeah, that is definitely something we try to be like, hey, I understand this is audio, but podcasting is its own bucket and you need to treat it different. You need to treat it as such in order to make it effective for you.
Yeah, you don't want like elevator music being used underneath the ad reads or something on a true crime podcast and totally shifting the mood. But in a similar vein, I work with some podcast hosts who do not particularly like the copy that they receive from brands pretty often. Is there anything you can do to sort of improve the ad experience when something like that happens? Or is there any sort of communication that can break through to brands and be like, hey, this is a little too stiff for the podcast, or this might be a little on the cheesier side for this audience and this topic? Is there any like leeway there, sort of?
Yeah, absolutely. We do I mean, especially from the sales perspective, just because we sit at this juncture where we're obviously selling it through to a particular client or an agency. And then on top of it, there's a lot of education that goes to these agencies or clients to make sure that it's like, hey, I understand you are protective of your brand. You don't want people just, spouting off for like 7 minutes saying stuff that you would never, ever, ever want associated with your brand. But at the same time, you need to be able to give the host enough leeway to be able to obviously make it their own, be able to speak to the audience in the way that they need to. So there is a lot of coaching in regards to that. And usually there are times in which we do, onboarding calls with like a producer of the show to be able to make sure that when they're sitting there and recording the ads, the producer or sometimes the host has that onboarding information to be able to like, oh, okay, like I can say this, I can't say that, because obviously there's so many different parameters that most clients are entering the space with. And so, yeah, there are safeguards that most large networks put in place in order to make sure that it's like, it's not as prescriptive of what you're talking about, where it's like, all right, here's the script, read it word for word. Like, we don't want to hear your personality. It's like, well, no, that's not why you're buying into this particular show. And we want to make sure that that's communicated appropriately so that ultimately expectations are met on both sides, where it's like the host has enough leeway to do their thing, but then the brand isn't surprised when we send through a spot and it's like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe they're talking about, their dog. They shouldn't have talked about their dog. It's like, no, that's like, that's what they do.
Yeah, and sometimes you just get certain brands that are a little hard to sort of have that levity with, because for instance, I've edited some ads that have come through that are about like life insurance plans. It's like, okay, you can only get so silly with those before it's a little too much of a joke, probably for the brand's liking. So I feel like sometimes it's just hard to find that perfect fit. But then when you do, you can really tell. And I actually have a question from an audience member, Kaylee. She wants to know, how do you encourage listener engagement through advertising?
I mean, that's like the, $1 million question or whatever, where ultimately what makes the podcast advertisement special is the fact that you have this, parasocial relationship with particular hosts. And because of the way that the podcast industry was built, there is such a direct line between the advertisements that are on the show and the host, where it's like you feel connected, where you're like, if I'm literally buying something that this host / my best friend tells me to buy, like they're probably seeing something in regards to this. Like they're getting a kickback or whatever. Like even if you're, a non-savvy, like just an average podcast consumer, you're being able to make that connective tissue come together much easier than you would, watching whatever, NFL on Sundays and being like, oh, the football players are probably seeing some money. It's like, no, like that is 9 million steps removed. So even though that value is already established in the podcast space, like the engagement level of people listening to the advertisement is all based around the host and obviously the personality, and being able to make sure that the host isn't just like saying yes to every single brand, isn't just like, a consummate pitch person. I mean, yes, there's an element of that, but it's making sure that, to your point of the life insurance example, that even though you may be, advertising something that is quote unquote boring, it's still being able to cut through like, no, this is an important part of your life. Like you need to have life insurance or whatever it is. And so the ability for hosts to sell it through to their audience in the most meaningful and, pardon the overused word of authentic, but like being able to use that connection that they have with their audience to say this is valuable increases that engagement from a listener perspective. And then on top of it too, because podcasting is still considered, even though it is ostensibly mainstream, like most people know what it is, it's still not like radio or television. So a lot of brands, and what I like to call challenger brands in the, overarching space of advertising, are approaching podcasts first and foremost. So a lot of the times you're hearing about new brands and products like first and foremost on podcasts, you're like, oh, I've never heard of this before. And that's exciting in and of itself as well, because then the consumer can be educated on something that's like, oh, damn, I didn't even know I needed something like this in my life, but this sounds cool and I'm interested. So it's a roundabout way of me trying to answer that. But basically, to sum it up, the host is, paramount, and then being able to tie that directly to supporting the show and the free content that you're getting.
I wanted to shift gears a little bit because this is sort of a different kind of advertising. And I wanted to talk about feed drops, because I've seen this in feeds like Serial, that when they sort of do an offshoot, like I believe it was called The Coldest Case in Laramie, came out, they put the trailer on the Serial feed. And I know a lot of podcast networks in particular will do this, where they either have like an ad spot and they just drop in ads for other shows on the network, or they're just straight up putting the entire trailer in another show's feed, which I think is a little more effective, because whether it's someone like me who has certain podcasts that just automatically download episodes as soon as there's a new one out, or, just scrolling through and being like, oh, I listened to that last episode of Serial, but what's this new thing that's suddenly on the feed? And, I did end up listening to The Coldest Case in Laramie, for instance. But what is your opinion on feed drops? Do you think trailers work? Do you think doing full episodes is effective as well?
To answer that simply, I think they're incredibly effective. I do think that they are effective, especially when you're matching up the type of content with the type of content dropping into a feed that obviously makes sense. And I've seen some networks just kind of, blast it out across every single one of their shows, even though it may not make sense. And I've seen, broadly speaking, advertisements go out where it's whatever, Paris Hilton's new podcast is coming out, and it's advertising on sports podcasts or whatever. And it's just what, I understand that people have different interests, but that seems like a real, square peg round hole fit.
Yeah, it's some whiplash.
Yeah, absolutely. But as far as the effectiveness, I think trailers are a good entry point, but I do think if you're, especially the limited run series, which obviously the Coldest Case in Laramie and many other either, true crime or news-based shows, when you are dropping a whole episode, I just think that's a perfect entry point, especially when people are using Coldest Case in Laramie and New York Times audio, broadly speaking, where it's all right, they have people who are, their flagship show, The Daily, they're able to launch a lot of shows off of that, but not disrupt people's feeds so much to where they're just oh, dude, I feel like I'm constantly punished with new shows that are coming out in The Daily or whatever. So it's they launched The Interview, which is part of their New York Times magazine. And basically they're dropping an episode each weekend that gets people engaged with that particular show. Whether they even subscribe to the other feed, they don't necessarily care, but they're just okay, you're already engaged with this, The Daily. Here's content that you probably will like as well. So I think it's incredibly effective as long as it's used, again, strategically and not just blanketed, because, it becomes the boy who cried wolf, where it's if you just keep yelling at people being oh, here's our new show, here's our new show, here's our new show, then you're just I can't, there's only so many new shows that I can consume. People like you and I will consume them all, but most normal consumers will be listen, I'm done.
I will try. I have to admit, my podcast listening went down significantly the more podcasts I started editing, because I was just okay, I'm doing this all day for, editing 6 to 8 hours. I can't also listen for 8 hours a day.
Yep.
But we're definitely two people who can go on about this all day. And I did want to leave with one last question on ads here. What do you think the future of podcast advertising looks like? I know that's a big, broad question, but we've talked about how important it is for the brand to mesh with the show, and then for, the copy to allow for the host to really put it into their own voice. But what do you see happening in the next, 12 to 18 months roughly with podcast ads?
I'll tackle it one or two different ways. One of them being the fact that I do think that we still have no clue what like the plateau / maximum audiences of podcasts. Like people are still discovering, people are still figuring out how to incorporate that in their daily lives. And so to me, that's really exciting because like we haven't seen a medium like this take hold in a mainstream way. I mean, since I've been alive, like people, talk about like virtual reality where it's just like, oh, we're all going to be living in our things. And it's like, there's the promise is there, but it's still not, people aren't walking around with, their Apple Vision Pro goggles everywhere. It's like, and so the fact that podcasting has been able to introduce itself, mature itself, and still we don't know what the tippy top of the audience is exciting. So I think that brands will still be figuring out how to fit that within the context of their media mix, where it's like, I, broadly speaking, used to see most brands engage with podcasts as like a very experimental thing where it's like, okay, I've done radio, I've done maybe some streaming audio, podcasting seems like a good fit. So like, let's extend that in there. And now I think brands are relatively intelligent, brands and agencies are relatively intelligent enough to be like, okay, I know what podcasts are. I know sort of where they sit, but now it's about figuring out where it's like, all right, say we're taking a pie chart of, my entire media budget, is podcast 5% of that? Is it 15% of that? And like figuring out where that sits. So I think that that's, again, exciting. And I also do think the way that we can measure it, the fact that there are things like pixel-based tracking now that exist in the podcast space, whereas like 2+ years ago, that didn't really exist, partially just because the technology wasn't there. So the fact that now you can have that as a data point on top of all the other things that you can point to from a analytics perspective is only going to make it more enticing for brands to lean into the space. So, overall, it's very exciting, but there is so much I wouldn't even call it a negative, but like the flip side of that is like, there's just so much education that has to happen still on the brand side and then the agency side to be like, hey, this, podcasting is a medium that's important. You need to consider this because you are missing this wide swath of audience that like doesn't interact with advertising ever. Like, maybe they see a billboard when they're driving, but like for the most part, they are subscribed to 5 different streaming services, all ad free or whatever. And so it's like sometimes the only way that people engage with advertising is in podcasts and then obviously maybe on like Instagram. And so again, that's kind of just like trying to make sure that brands know that this is an environment in which advertising is effective and advertising is trusted as opposed to, many other mediums where it's just like, oh, dude, like, stop annoying me. Like, yes, ads are broadly speaking are annoying, but in podcasting, they are far less annoying than, your YouTube pre-rolls or whatever.
Yeah. Coming from the places that you and I come from where we've made our own podcasts and, I never really ran ads on mine because they were never really big enough, but just knowing that that is what sustains a lot of creators, I think also the listeners are a little more willing to put up with it, I guess you could say. That's probably not the best way to phrase that.
No,
but,
it's true.
They're more willing to listen to ads because it more directly supports the people who they know are putting a lot of time and effort into these shows. Whereas, when you have Hulu with ads or something, it's like Disney's just getting more money for a lot of that stuff and, then goes and cancels one of your favorite shows or something. So that then you get upset. And obviously some podcasts do get canceled as well, as you and I have seen. And, I think ads are a really great way for a lot of shows to monetize, even for smaller shows that aren't on networks like Wondery. I always tell people like, go hit up some local businesses or something and places that have online stores, but they're local to you and you can just sort of start making a little money for your show that way. And you're supporting local businesses and hopefully getting your listeners to support local businesses and just, things like that you can do. Or I tell people to do cross promo swaps on podcasts all the time. And, you know, we talked about the feed drop specifically, but even just having the host read their own ad for someone else's show. So, like, for instance, if you were to like talk about lead singer syndrome on 100 words or less, you know, that would probably get a lot of your listeners to go check out Shane's podcast. And that being Shane Told from Silverstein, for anyone who is not familiar with these music podcasts. But yeah, I think ads are a great way to monetize shows, and there are a bunch of different ways you can do it. And, you know, they don't even, again, have to be paid ads. You could just do a swap with people, you know, and you're getting the word out there about your show. You're not even necessarily, you know, getting money for promoting a brand, but you're at the same time, you know, you have ads that will make you money and you have ads that will get you more listeners.
Yeah, exactly. But you can do both. You can be able to grow your audience, and then obviously, if you, to your point, if you're just doing so like a simple, you know, barter where it's just like, oh, you'll give me, you know, a free microphone if I do this. It's like, okay, that's like, again, that's good. Like everybody's going to win at the end.
Yeah, I've come across some brands that don't have a budget for marketing, but they're like, hey, we'll send you product and you know, you can use that. So honestly, sometimes that's how people get their podcast started. They, you know, get microphones from Rode, which is what I have sitting in front of me right now. And that's, you know, that's totally fine too. You're still getting something in return, and you're able to create a better product probably because of it. But Ray, thank you for nerding out about ads with me today.
My absolute pleasure. I'll talk about this to anybody who cares.